An election this evening. Linda, I think you summed it up well. I think everybody would be very surprised to see an election on the very first ballot on the first night. But we have had some remarkably short conclaves in the past. Don, you want to share some of those with us?
Even recently, both Pope Francis and Pope Benedict were elected very quickly on the second day. And but Pius XII was the same way. Sometimes people go in and the momentum is so high that within a few ballots, it is rather unlikely that we will get a pope on the first ballot. The first ballot usually is in conclaves for the cardinals to test out strength. Sometimes they offer sort of honorific votes. I know in the past, in the early 20th century, was often used as an occasion for non-Italian popes. Non-Italian electors to write in non-Italian names, just to establish the precedent that it didn't have to be an Italian on the first day. And it won't be like Pope Julius II, who was elected within a few hours of the conclave starting. But there always is a danger, because in 1334, when the main candidate wouldn't agree to the cardinal's demands, they didn't know what to do, and so they held a ballot, and everyone chose the least likely candidate that they possibly could. Jacques Fournier, who became Benedict XII, was a very good pope that nobody had expected, and he was elected on the first ballot. So it can happen, but it is really quite a very rare experience.
I think it's very interesting to hear and to look back and to uncover what we know about the process of voting, how it happens. We discovered, for example, didn't we, that Francis had been quite a potential contender during the previous election in 2005, but then for the sake of unity, we were told that he stepped back so that Benedict could in fact garner that two-third majority that he needed to take over from Pope John Paul II. I was really struck just now listening to the voices of the people in the square, ordinary people. Every single one of them almost is talking about unity, the need for unity. And I think this question of how long the conclave goes on for is seen very much as an important signal regarding the unity of the Church, because the longer it goes on for, clearly the cardinals are unable to decide on the kind of man they want to lead the Church, and therefore I think there's a certain pressure mounting day by day, or vote by vote even, to try and show, in a particularly polarized world that we're living in at the moment, where people are so deeply divided, to have a real show of unity on the part of the Church leaders. I think that's going to be weighing most heavily on a lot of those cardinals' minds at the moment.
And Philippa, you have a strong focus on humanism, and as a member of the Church of England, you've done a lot of work with the question of Christian unity. The Pope, from the Catholic point of view, is of course the center of unity, and that's been the focus of a lot of ecumenical discussions. How does that play out in the overarching Christian world, as the Pope intended to be a center of unity, but also a focus of contention with the relationships between Catholic and non-Catholic communities?
Well, I mentioned earlier the moment that Pope Francis came out onto the balcony describing himself as the Bishop of Rome, and what a strong signal that was to other Christian leaders about his role, not trying to describe himself as Supreme Pontiff or use some of these other titles that can be quite alienating, but describe himself as the primus inter pares, in a sense, the first among equals of the bishops, and therefore this title Bishop of Rome was very significant, together with the other kind of signals that he gave early on in his pontificate. And yes, of course, the question of the papacy is a crucial, it's the crux of the matter in many of these ecumenical dialogues. The Orthodox dialogues are discussing the role of the Pope in the first millennium and in the second millennium, and it's also, very much the discussion that's going on in the other, the churches of the Reformation. The dialogues there are also discussing the role of the Pope, and that's why I think Francis's legacy is so significant, because he made very important overtures about the way that he could work together with other Christian leaders. But of course we can't forget the encyclical Ut Unum Sint from Pope John Paul II back in, I think it was 1995, when he actually asked other Christian leaders to come forward with ideas, to make proposals as to how the role of the papacy could be acceptable to other churches, to other Christian communions. And this is still very much a work that's ongoing. It sort of fell a little bit by the wayside during the previous decade or two, but it's very much front and center again. And I think there's a lot of, I think we're going to see over the coming months again some responses to that. The council, or the dicastery as it now is for Christian unity, has gathered together some of these responses, and we've seen the publication of a book bringing together a lot of these responses. So it's very much at the heart, as you say, of the conversations and at the heart of the dialogues with other Christian churches. So very important to see what direction the new Pope will take on this, and whether he will prioritize this as an important issue, because of course the division of the churches is one of the biggest scandals of the Christian world. It's so much easier when people see unity, when people see united churches, to be able to believe and to be able to make a commitment to that.
Thank you, Philippa. We've been talking with Philippa Hitchen, Don Prudlow, our guests, as we enter into this first hour of watching and waiting for the election of the new Pope. If you've just joined us, earlier this evening we saw the cardinals enter into conclave, and now everybody, I think, kind of around the world is waiting to see the smoke rising from the Sistine Chapel. If you are just joining us, I'd like to offer you a very warm welcome. Also, a thank you to all of our television partners and radio partners, especially EWTN TV, Catholic Faith Network in America, Shalom World Television's Network USA, at Madarshan TV, Catholic TV, Madha TV India, and UCTV, Uganda Catholic Television. Also radio partners Luminous Radio and Radio Katipunan in the Philippines. Welcome to all of you. My name is Christopher Wells, and I'm joined here with my colleague Linda Bordoni, and our guests.
And our guests, our most prestigious guests, Philippa Hitchen and Professor Prudlow. But I do suggest a tiny musical break as we continue to watch the sunset. So here we are on air as we await the smoke that will chug out of the chimney on the Sistine Chapel. We all remember, or more than remember, we're not that old, but we do. We have all read about the famous conclave in 1958 when John the 23rd was elected. The cardinals convened on, I think it was the 26th of October, and immediately white smoke was seen to appear out of the chimney, and obviously the crowd erupted in applause, only to discover that the burning process wasn't as they thought it should be, and it soon turned black. And unfortunately, it happened this next day as well, exactly the same thing. And finally, on the third day, he was actually elected on the 28th of October after 2 false alarms. It really was white smoke. I think the people were probably a bit wary at that time, but yes, the smoke is incredibly magnetizing, isn't it, as we watch that chimney.
I certainly have very strong memories of a former colleague here at Vatican Radio doing some coverage for the election. I believe it was for John Paul II, and I remember him talking about the dirty grey smoke, a Scotsman talking about the dirty grey smoke, and he wasn't quite sure whether it was white or whether it was black. And quite often at the beginning, I mean, I do remember the previous 2 that I have covered, I remember that it is a little bit difficult at the beginning to see. It starts off quite slowly and then it seems to kind of gain momentum, and I think there's been some work on the kind of chemical processes, hasn't there? Maybe somebody else knows a bit more about
they did begin to use the chemicals for both the white and the black.
Absolutely, yeah.
But you're right about the evocative power of the smoke. This has become sort of a symbol, and now the webcam, people will put webcams on at home, and I saw that we have some real enthusiasts, because 12 hours before I saw there was a chimney webcam before they'd even gone into conclave with 11,000 visitors, 11,000 watching. Wow. Currently. So people are really transfixed by this, but it was a good addition, I think it was 2013 when Benedict, because of the confusion about this, that when there's white smoke, the bells of St. Peter's will peal out as well. Right. So that will be a confirmatory. And it's also an issue in winter conclaves, right? Because it's night, and it's very difficult to see the color of the smoke at night. And so those bells were a good addition.
Although I remember it took quite a while for the bells to actually start pealing, so the people were cheering wildly in the square, and it was only quite a significant time after that the bells actually confirmed that.
In fact, I remember that conclave as well. I think we all remember that very clearly. And yes, that's exactly right, because even with the addition of the chemicals, the smoke wasn't clear. You talked about it, Philippa. When the smoke first comes out, first you've got people asking, well, is smoke coming out? Is that a cloud? Is that really what it is? And then it becomes a little bit more definitely smoke coming out of the chimney. And then you say, well, it looks kind of gray, it looks kind of white. And they had told us here in the studio that they were going to ring the bells as soon as the smoke came out. And I think for the first election in decades, we had smoke that was pretty clearly white, but then the bells didn't ring the way they were supposed to for a long while.
And this happens, right? I mean, you remember when Benedict was elected and Cardinal Medina came out, and as soon as he said Habemus Papam, the band started playing. And he had to wait for about 15-20 seconds, and it was very awkward. But so we saw the beautiful, magnificent liturgical choreography today, that this is still an event that's run by human beings, and sometimes that these things can happen, and they lend a lot of great color to the history.
Well, we're on the subject of the smoke coming out of the chimney. The other lasting memory I have of these conclaves, and watching the screen again today, is the seagulls. The seagulls who seem to be magnetically drawn to that chimney, possibly because of the warmth that comes out of it. But I do remember during the 2013 conclave sitting in studio just as we are today, discussing ecumenical interfaith legacies of Pope Benedict, looking at the characteristics of the new man, what would be required. And I remember the producer at that time saying to me, talk about the seagull. You know, the seagull has its own hashtag. The seagull is trending on Twitter, and it's just quite fascinating how people take different aspects of these, as you say, very traditional, very historical events, and yet give them a particularly modern twist. I find that fascinating.
I heard the other day that, in fact, inside the Sistine Chapel there are 2 ovens. And that's because in the one oven they burn the ballots. In the other oven, they actually put the chemicals you were talking about, Professor Prudlow, which are the ones that will produce the right coloured smoke.
We hope.
We hope. Yes. There was one when they were still trying to. They were testing it. When were they? Do you remember when they were testing the chemicals in 2005 before the conclave? And they just the air, it just turned black. I mean, the entire sky above the Vatican was just black with smoke because they'd put in way too much of the chemical at that time.
But I think it's interesting again how we've seen a lot of pictures recently, as you say, these two ovens in the Sistine Chapel before, this veil of secrecy that on the one hand was so fascinating to people outside the confines of the Vatican, but on the other hand people are equally fascinated now they can see the process. We saw the workmen going in with the scaffolding and putting up the chimney and putting the ovens into place, and I think that's been very...
Yeah, there's a beautiful video on Vatican News that shows the room of tears, which is the room where the Pope will receive his vestments and cry.
And have some time for prayer and crying at his new responsibilities.
Before after he has accepted the what would we call it, the proclamation, because the cardinals ask the Pope whether he accepts or not, and so...
And he can say no.
He can say no, right. Anyway, please go and look at our video, because it shows that room of tears. It shows the 3 different sized vestments that have been made to fit whoever is elected. It shows...
well, after it was a little tight on Pope John the 23rd, they knew they had to have a range of sizes for the
But
possible
interestingly,
Pope.
Linda, you were telling me that the traditional papal tailors that has been producing these vestments for so many decades, apparently there's been a change.
Yes, there has been a change. So we all knew Gamarelli. I think we all bought socks at Gamarelli, the cardinal socks. This year it's Mancinelli, who apparently makes a bit of a more a lighter textile, better for transpiration, more comfortable. So yes.
In fact, we talked about all of the people inside the Vatican who help with the conclave. One of the people that's there is a tailor on hand. They have a small, medium, and large cassock, but they have someone right there so that when he puts it on, they can make adjustments so it's not overflowing, it's not too tight. They've got some room to breathe, so to speak. In the legend about John the 23rd, who was a portly Italian, famously from peasant stock, as they say, in Italy, and the story was that when he put on the extra large white cassock, it still wasn't big enough, and they had to open up the back of it and kind of tie it together like a hospital gown, obviously with his regular clothes underneath. But there's some of the stories that we hear from the Catholics.
I noticed that hanging in the Room of Tears is the little red cape, which Pope Francis did not wear.
He chose not to wear.
He chose not to wear.
Yeah,
why did he choose not to wear that red cape?
It was a gesture of he meant it as a gesture of humility, in the sense that he wanted to be seen as Francis, as Bishop of Rome, in a simplicity. But I don't think that there should be any judgment if the new Pope chooses to wear it. I mean, it's the proper garment for that moment. There's nothing hieratic. It's just a particular garment for the papacy. And but when you say the tailors and those great videos that you had, it should remind us of the hundreds of people that work to put this together behind the scenes, all the Vaticanisti, all the people that work they are so hard to make these things come off, the infirmarians, the people that prepare the food, and the people that prepared the conclave, the choir, the masters of ceremonies. It's really
it's a big production.
It's an amazing production, and it's an irregular production, right? I mean, I think of in England, right, trying to practice a coronation after over 6 decades, and it's sort of the same thing here. You don't know when it's going to happen. You start to think about it. People come, people go, and there's books, but it's one thing to reduce a book to actual practice. And now that we have videos and things like that, it's so good to record those things and to help people to remember how difficult it is.
And we weren't working in those days back in the 1970s, but I wonder what it must have been like to have had two of them in very, very close succession within, what was it, 33 days?
33 days.
Was the length of the papacy, and so then
Of John Paul
the period
I.
after that when they elected the John Paul II.
So barely the entire Vatican staff barely had time to get to relax and to recover from one, and then they're doing it all over again. It must have been an extraordinary moment for
It was very interesting. I come from a very small diocese in the United States, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which very few people perhaps have ever heard of. But one of our claims to fame, my former bishop, was one of the very, very few bishops appointed by Pope John Paul I. So one of the very few people in the whole church who was the subject of an act of the month-long papacy of John Paul I. And I think a lot of us will have stories about our interactions with popes, not just the people who work here, but people throughout the world who come and see the popes. Do you have some memories of the popes that you've experienced through your time?
Well, Pope Francis memorably invited all the Vatican staff. As far as I know, it was the first time for something like this, but he invited all of us to join him for the masses that he instigated in the Santa Marta Chapel, where he chose to live rather than in the Apostolic Palace. And he began the tradition of giving a sermon every morning in the Santa Marta Chapel, and we were all invited to go along. So I think it was maybe a month or two after his inauguration, the inauguration of his papacy, that I was able to go along, and that to me was an extraordinary moment. The previous time that I'd seen him was just after I think it was 3 or 4 days after the papacy, the inauguration, or the election rather, when he was with all the journalists in the Paul VI Hall. You were there too, weren't you? And he announced why he had chosen the name Francis. He wanted to be to honour the name of Francis as a man of peace, a man of poverty, and a man of protection of creation. And these were, of course, 3 themes that he would develop so strongly throughout his pontificate, and that was again an extraordinary moment.
It was extraordinary also that he called the journalists to thank them for the work they had done during such an intense period. It was, we didn't realize how moving that gratitude would be. I can't but help think of his very last public audience, was to thank the medics, the doctors and the staff at the hospital who had taken care of him.
The other thing I remember about that audience with the journalists at the beginning was the way that he said, I'm going to bless you, but I'm going to do it in silence because many of you are non-believers or not share of the Catholic faith. And so there was immediately this great sense of openness and a great sense of respect for people who didn't necessarily belong to the Catholic Church. And all these signs at the beginning were just so very encouraging to people who'd somehow been feeling a little bit excluded or hadn't been given the same kind of welcome in the past. So these were very strong memories for me, and the Santa Marta was my opportunity to mention to him my interest in ecumenism and how I was at that time the warden of All Saints Church, Anglican Church here in Rome. And another important memory for me in that sense was that in 2016 I was able to welcome him because he became the first Pope to visit the Anglican Church in his own diocese of Rome. Of course, popes had visited Anglican churches before, notably John Paul II in 1982 became the first Pope to travel to England since the Reformation, and going into Canterbury Cathedral. Of course, there have been many papal visits to Anglican churches, but for the Pope to come to the Anglican Church in his own diocese was an extraordinary moment, and it was marking the 200th anniversary of our community here in Rome, and he came and gave had a great conversation with people. It was a beautiful liturgy, and it was on that occasion, if I'm not mistaken, he announced he intended to visit South Sudan Milan, together with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moderator of the Church of Scotland. That hadn't been. There was a bit of an uproar because it hadn't been officially announced by the Vatican, but he announced he intended to go anyway, which was typical of the Francis style, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Do you have any memories?
Well, yes. It's funny that all four of us were at that journalist audience. That was an enjoyable. But he joked that day too. Remember when he joked about his papal name, about how whether I may have gone with Adrian the Seventh, as the great reformer, but he didn't live very long. So, and then he said, well, I could have taken Clement, the Pope that suppressed the Jesuits, and so that got everybody loosened up, and I thought that was a really charming way. But I do also remember a moment with Pope Benedict. It was a strange one. We were in Valle d'Aosta after we'd been in Rome for a while, so we were away from Roman things, and we were driving through town, and it was there's traffic. I was like, this is like Roman traffic. I mean, why is there so much traffic up in this little corner of Italy? And I turned my head, and right next to me was Pope Benedict. He'd just been taken to the hospital after he'd broken his arm when he was on vacation there. And so he was right next to me and my family in the car, like going the other way on the street stop.
Did you wave?
We waved, yes.
So we're looking at the screen here. We're looking at the square, getting close to what could be a time for smoke. What do you think?
Well, we're expecting the vote to take place shortly after the cardinals went into conclave, the first vote this evening. But as a lot of people have noted, it's pretty well known, this is the largest group of cardinals ever to enter into conclave, 133. If you watch the broadcast of the entrance, it takes a little while for 133 mostly elderly cardinals to get up, to cast their vote, for the votes to be counted. We heard Monsignor Burns' very excellent elaboration of that process. So we're not sure how long it takes, and I think that's a challenge for all of us, but also for the people coming in the square. If you were watching at the beginning of the broadcast, the square was not empty, but there weren't a whole lot of people there, and they've been filtering in.
It's really filled up.
It's really filled up. I think we all remember previous conclaves when the white smoke comes out, everybody in Rome is going to be coming to St. Peter's Square. But just to talk a little bit about the process this evening, we are expecting a vote perhaps around 7:30 in about 10 minutes, but there's no precise timing. So it could be any time, and we will have people watching for that first wisp of smoke and then to try and determine what color it is. And Phil, Linda, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what we can expect for the next couple of days in terms of looking for the smoke and the outcome of the different votes in the Sistine Chapel.
Well, the one interesting thing I've just discovered is, as you were saying, there are two separate votes.
Oven, yeah.
Okay.
Well, just one on the first day, right?
Just one on the first day, but as from tomorrow morning, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. So should the smoke arise in the middle of one of those sessions, it'll be white for sure.
That's right. Yes.
Right?
That's because if they go immediately to a second vote if it's a failed vote, and so that means we won't get smoke until around noon. If it's
even later, in fact, I think we're expecting around 1 o'clock.
Around 1. So if we do absolutely right, if we get it at 11:30, 10:30, 11, it will be white smoke. Yeah.
I heard an interesting little detail. You were talking about people rushing from around Rome. When people hear the news, they tend to gather in the square to see who the new pope will be. I read a lovely detail from the English College, the Venerable English College, where the seminarians from the UK trained to become priests, and there was obviously a question about were they allowed to run out of their classes if they heard news of course all of them will have their cell phones, I imagine, so they'll get news almost within seconds of it happening, and apparently there has been a ruling from the college that seminarians are allowed to get up in the middle of classes and to go and congregate in the square to acclaim the new pope if and when it happens during the day.
I remember I was a student at the Angelicum during the election of Pope Benedict in 2005, and that same question came up. Of course, John Paul had been pope for almost 27 years, so a conclave was a new thing. And the college didn't make any determination, so the classes were going on during the conclave, and as soon as it became evident that the Pope had been elected, there were people who left class. And I remember some of the professors being horribly offended that the students had left for a truly momentous historical occasion. And the Angelicum, I'm sure that was the reason for their determination this year. They put out a specific statement. They announced it on social media. As soon as we get news of the white smoke, classes are suspended with immediate effect. The adoration in the chapel at the Angelicum will be closed with benediction so that everybody who wants to can come to Rome, can come to St. Peter's Square and be there for the announcement. When we do get the white smoke, I think you'll all remember, there's a period of time between when the smoke comes out. It's about 40 minutes. We're expecting about 40 minutes to an hour between the white smoke and when the Pope has gotten his robes together. He has prayed for a while. They've organized themselves. So about 40 minutes to an hour. In the last conclave, which of course was absolutely historic because we still had Pope Benedict alive, that was delayed even further because Pope Francis wanted the first one to hear the news to be Pope Emeritus, as he eventually decided on the title, the Pope Emeritus, to be the first to receive the news. So they had to call him. And the story is that he was glued to the TV set watching the chimney, as we all are now, and they were ignoring the phone. And finally, someone picked up and said, "It's the cardinals. They want you to be the first to know." So there's a little delay. We were talking earlier, there are 2 votes in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and the expectation is there's a possibility of maybe as early as 10:30 or 11, but certainly a burning of the ballots at around 1 o'clock for the morning ballots, and then in the afternoon, possibly as early as 5 or 5:30, and certainly a burning of the ballots around. Tomorrow we're looking at perhaps as early as 7:30 for the second one. So if you go to our Vatican News website, you can see kind of a program that will give you an idea of when you can tune in and get the latest news from the
Meanwhile,
conclave.
I'm seeing there are 30,000 people in the square at the moment.
30,000?
30,000.
And that will increase
augment,
until
yes.
the smoke comes out.
Yeah.
But also, we haven't had an election on the third ballot. We haven't had an election on the second ballot. We have had an election on a third ballot, but not since 1939. And so both Francis and Benedict, I think, were elected on the fourth ballot. So that would mean the evening.
Benedict on the 4th and Francis on the 5th. Although there was a little confusion, which came out subsequently, and as we heard from the oath, the popes can allow people to speak about some aspects of the conclave. That's entirely up to the new pope's discretion. And there was apparently an extra blank ballot added to the vote, so that when they counted all the ballots, they had to immediately redo the vote because they want to make absolutely certain that there can be no question about the valid election of the Pope. We know historically that there have been some contested elections.
Occasionally, yes. It's being a very important position. There's sometimes been 2 or even 3 claimants to the papacy. We haven't had that in about 600 years. But the last Pope before Benedict to resign, Gregory XII, was one of the 3 popes who they all were either deposed or resigned in order to have the election of Martin V, who restored the papacy to Rome, began the Renaissance here in the city, where we get so many of these beautiful buildings and so many of these beautiful traditions.
So we've all been reading hard about what happens after the Pope steps out onto that balcony of blessings. I think it's called the loggia. It will be the protodeacon, right, who will announce the Habemus Papam.
Unless the protodeacon is elected, and then we'll know even quicker.
Then we'll know even quicker.
And he will give the formula in Latin. He will read the new Pope's name in Latin.
Right.
And then afterwards, the pontiff will step out, if I'm not mistaken.
And that's when he has his first opportunity to introduce himself to the world. Philip, again, you were here. You made the announcement, as I
Yes.
recall, in studio of Pope Francis. But tell us your experience of that night when Pope Francis was elected, both here in the studio, but also as you were looking out at the crowds as they came to see the new Pope.
Yes, you're quite right. We were doing a similar kind of marathon, for the days leading up to the white smoke, and it was the third day, wasn't it, that the actual news came, and the second day of the
afternoon
that's right,
of the second
Late
day.
evening, in fact.
the afternoon.
Yeah.
Yes, it was quite late in the evening, which we may be going on to here today as well. But it was a similar sort of time. I seem to remember. My other former colleague Susie Hodges was in studio, and as we were watching, the smoke started coming out of the chimney, and yes, you could hear the crowd going wild below. It really is. It's quite an extraordinary moment, I think. It's one thing to be here in studio, it's another to be down in the square, I think, because
I was in the square.
you were there,
I
weren't
was
you?
in
You
the
were
square.
reporting, you were doing what Devon has been doing for us today, reporting from the square, despite all the difficulties of getting a signal.
I don't think the blockers were as powerful in 2000. I don't think the blockers were as powerful in 2013 because
I can't imagine. They have to keep up with such technology today. I mean, you were
Exactly.
talking about the sweeping of the Sistine Chapel and also the Santa Marta. I would assume they have to sweep that as well.
They
But
do,
the cardinals had to
indeed.
turn in all of their cell phones. Check your phone at the door, and so they have to.
There's also a bit of a natural blockage that happens, especially after the white smoke, when you go from maybe 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 to suddenly
everyone.
a 250,000 people, 300,000 people, not just in St. Peter's Square, up the Via della Conciliazione, the road leading to St. Peter's, and everybody has their cell phone on. And with great respect for the Italian telecommunications company, that's a big burden for any system. And so when you are trying to get out there and you're trying to send the video of you with the selfie with the new Pope, you might have trouble getting a hold of your friends and family back in England, back in the United States.
that was most noticeable even during the recent funeral for Pope Francis, when you have those numbers. Again, I think the figures were 400,000 officially, weren't they, between those gathered in the square and those who were along Via della Conciliazione and down on the route towards St. Mary Major for the burial when Francis was laid in his final resting place. And again, the difficulty of getting any kind of signal to be able to send messages even was quite challenging. So yes, it is a problem, and people are gathering, and of course everybody now has a phone on them, and
Yeah.
that was another thing I remember, because it was getting dark during the
I remember, in
waiting
fact,
for Pope
though.
Francis.
when
It
when
was
the smoke
earlier.
came out, it was dusk, but it was still light out. And by the time they got to the actual pronouncement, the night sky was completely black.
And there was a flashing of all those millions, or at least hundreds, tens of thousands of cell phones as people tried to take the first pictures of the new Pope. And that is something which, of course, is quite different from in past times when people would acclaim by applauding and cheering. And
But applauding and cheering has a lot to say for itself, because I remember being in that square and Bergoglio stepping out. And to be honest, I didn't recognize him. I didn't know who he was. But
You weren't
close
the only
to
one.
me was a group of Argentinians, pilgrims. And immediately I realized he must be Argentinian because they went wild. And so I think I was online, I don't remember. I think I said, I think he's an Argentinian.
And then, of course, everybody is looking for the biographies and trying to and the internet risks crashing as well, because everybody is trying to download that biography. Interestingly, I've noticed that the Vatican this time has come up with an extremely helpful dashboard, which again is unprecedented. As far as I remember, we had to do a lot of the research ourselves, but we now have a Vatican dashboard which gives you all the details that you ever wanted to know, or the basic information about the cardinals, all the cardinal electors, who they are, where they come from, how old they are, who created them cardinals, what their main features, if you like, of their ministry has been so far, which is incredibly helpful for all of us trying to cover these
that's
things.
progress, Phil. It is two-faced, in the sense that on the one hand, yes, we do have a lot of information much more readily at our fingertips. On the other hand, we are expected to be active on so many more platforms and to be there. And so it's been a really steep learning curve for us as well. You know, we're going to have to be there when the smoke is white. We're going to take a screenshot. We're going to do a video. We're going to have a name out there. It's very challenging for journalists this time and age.
And Linda, I'd like to go back to something you said about the applause, where applause is very significant. As you mentioned, Dawn, in the past, sometimes it was by acclaim. It was the voice of the people of the city of Rome. But even today, in various liturgies, we hear the people have an opportunity to signify their acceptance. And it's not a legalistic form, but there is a place for the people to express their approval of a choice of a priest, of a bishop, and less formally here for the Pope.
Well, Saint Cyprian, when he was defending the papacy of Cornelius, this was in 250 A.D., he said that the clergy of Rome consented to him. He was ordained by all the bishops and by the acclamation of the people. And so this is actually, it is kind of liturgical, the reception of the Pope coming out on the loggia, and then the people acceding to that election in the square. It's a very important moment. Now, sometimes the people historically have not always been so peaceable. They've made their desires known. So at the beginning, when Urban VI was elected, they made it very clear that they wanted an Italian, the people of Rome, and so that was an important way, and that's a way historically that synodality can work out too, in a way that people can have their voices heard, and this is a very historical way that people have had their voices heard.
When you mentioned that we were talking earlier about acclaiming the Pope and thinking back to that election in 2013, of course, you have that incredible acclamation and cheering, but then the other lasting memory that I have is Pope Francis asking the people to pray for him before he gave them the blessing. And in an instant you had however many thousands of people there were in the square falling silent, and so you had this extraordinary contrast between the noise of the cheering and the applause and then the silence as he stood there for really quite a long time with asking people to pray for him and to pray for his new ministry. That was really quite something unusual, I found.
The sentry seagull is back, waiting for the news.
Waiting for the news. I'm reading something quite unusual for me. I'm reading that it could even be possible that today, in the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals have actually not voted, and therefore there will not be a signal. It's a remote possibility, but it exists.
Yeah, all the procedures that govern everything from the moment we learn of the death of the Holy Father, or the moment of his resignation, through the ceremonies to say farewell to the previous Pope, through the period of mourning, the organization of the conclave, how the College of Cardinals organizes the events, to the entry into the conclave, and all of the details of the voting are laid out very, very precisely in a document which we've heard many times, Universi Dominici Gregis, the name of the document that covers all of this. And what that document foresees is that normally the cardinals would proceed immediately to a vote this evening. However, that's not an absolute, and there is admittedly a pretty remote possibility that they don't proceed immediately to a vote. There's also what would be a very strange possibility, but we've talked about this earlier, not unheard of, if the cardinals should choose someone who is not in the Sistine Chapel, they might take a vote, but the vote is not formalized and elect a pope, but the pope is not elected until he accepts. So you wouldn't burn the ballots, you wouldn't see the white smoke, and meanwhile the cardinal electors would have to call outside the cardinal, probably make a phone call, and ask their choice to become pope. And in that case, we would not see the smoke, and then people would really start talking.
Yes, that would be a journalistic crisis for sure. At that
question: when was the last pope who was not in the in the conclave to be elected?
It was Urban the Sixth. It was that election right before the Great Western Schism. He was the Archbishop of Bari, and so they elected someone outside of the conclave, and so they had to send him notice of that. And it took a long while, and the people of Rome were relatively restless until they found out that, don't worry, we have elected an Italian. And they all went home and had a party. So.
Meanwhile, as we've been chatting away here, the cardinals are still gathered in one of the probably most magnificent chapels in the whole world. Full of symbology as well. We all know the final judgment on the wall of the apse. We all know the creation on the ceiling. But there are a lot of other paintings in there as well, including some Raphaels and a very symbolic Perugino, which shows Christ handing the keys to St. Peter. Delving into the bottomless archive of Vatican Radio, I found another program by Veronica Scaresbrick. It's a short one, this. She speaks to a professor of fine arts, Brina Ennis, who tells us about that particular fresco, which is part of the cycle of Christ on the right-hand wall as you enter the Sistine Chapel. Yes, and we were listening there to Breda Ennis speaking to Veronica Scaresbrick. She mentioned there the 265th successor of Peter, so she obviously did that program just before the election of Benedict XVI. One element we haven't mentioned today, probably the most important, is the guidance of the Holy Spirit in this process. This morning the cardinals gathered in a very important mass, the mass for the election of the new pontiff. The mass was presided over by Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re. He's the dean of the College of Cardinals, and he asked the participants in the conclave, the cardinals, to join in prayer to ask the Holy Spirit for guidance. Well, that's very important. He recalled the reading in the Acts of the Apostles, how after Christ's ascension into heaven, all were united and persevering in prayer together with Mary. And the cardinal said that all gathered here today are praying together, as well as just a few hours before the start of the conclave, under the gaze of Our Lady beside the altar in this basilica, he said, which rises above the tomb of the Apostle Peter. Professor Prudler, how important is this element?
It's irreducible. I mean, the selection. We saw that with the prayers at the entrance of the conclave. We saw it with the Missa Pro Leggendo this morning. The intoning of the Veni Sancti Spiritus, the invocation of the Holy Spirit on the work of the conclave. But it's also important that we remember, as the Holy Spirit guides and protects the Church, that we know that we also must cooperate with His promptings, with the promptings of the Spirit, in order to rightly follow God's will in our lives. And the cardinal electors have to do this too. It surprises some people sometimes that when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, Benedict XVI spoke about the Holy Spirit's role in the conclave, and he said, "I would not say that the Holy Spirit picks the Pope. I would say that the Spirit does not exactly take control of the affair, but rather, like a good educator, as it were, leaves us much space and much freedom without entirely abandoning us." And so the Missa Pro Leggendo this morning, the ceremonies at the beginning were meant to help the cardinals to be open to the Spirit in that way, and to put aside other agendas, other political ideologies, and be open to the promptings of grace. And so that's because, and I think that was something very wise of Benedict to say, because in the past, I mean, there's not always been good popes. I mean, in the history of the Church, there have been quite bad popes, and yet the Church endures, and that's the astonishing thing from an historical perspective. And so today we pray that we are open to the promptings of the Holy Spirit in the conclave and for the cardinal electors.
I think it's particularly interesting that Mass is not just for the cardinals, but of course it's a Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, open to the public and to a lot of other people who want to come along and want to be part of that moment at the beginning. As you say, it's marking the beginning of the conclave, and to be actually part of that and to be able to pray together with the cardinal electors for the new Pope is an incredibly moving moment. And again, I noticed this morning there were a number of the ecumenical representatives here in Rome. We have a new Anglican bishop, Bishop Anthony, who is the new head of the Anglican Centre. We have the head of the Methodist Ecumenical Office, the Reformed churches, and they were there together with representatives from the Council, the Dicastery for Christian Unity, again praying together and gathered together with the cardinal electors, praying for a successful outcome to this conclave under the guidance, as you say, of the Holy Spirit.
And that homily by Cardinal Re brings us back to the whole concept of unity as well, because he also reminded those present about the duty to maintain the unity of the Church on the path traced out by Christ. And he explained that unity is marked by profound communion in diversity, provided that full fidelity to the gospel is maintained. unity in a fractured world is even more poignant. We're living in a time in which the world is so divided. Just last night we learnt of yet another conflict, and I'm referring to the clashes that erupted between India and Pakistan, as every day we remember Gaza, we remember Ukraine, we remember Myanmar, we remember South Sudan, we remember Sudan. Unfortunately, the list is very, very long. So we really do need a moral compass back in this world.
I thought it was interesting during the lead up to this conclave to see the cardinals actually issuing a statement just ahead of their gathering here in the Sistine Chapel, issuing a statement calling for peace, calling for an end to conflicts, and mentioning particularly Ukraine and Gaza, but as you say, by implication the many other conflicts that are going on around the world. Of course, peace and an end to conflict was such a key theme for Pope Francis, and I thought it was particularly significant that the cardinals felt it necessary to show that they were absolutely following in this direction, and therefore that these, if you like, considerations that go way beyond those of the Catholic Church and of the Christian world, but the need for dialogue, the need for mediation, the need for peacemakers in our world is particularly on their minds at the moment. And it'll be interesting to see. Of course, we know that there have been that there are cardinals representing countries. I think it's more than 70 countries across the world. Is that right?
Around 70 countries, yes, more than 70.
And therefore, obviously, these political considerations are of extreme importance, alongside all the other church business, of course, that they will have been discussing.
And that communique that you mentioned, Philippa, was issued yesterday. We, the Cardinals of the Holy Roman Church, meeting in General Congregation before the beginning of the conclave. That's the meetings that they hold in anticipation of the election. We, the Cardinals, noting with regret that there's been no progress in advancing the peace process in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in so many other parts of the world. And on the contrary, attacks have intensified, especially against civilian populations. We Cardinals make a heartfelt appeal to all parties involved to reach a permanent ceasefire as soon as possible and to negotiate without preconditions, without further delay, the peace long desired by the peoples involved and by the entire world. And that was certainly a constant theme in Pope Francis' pontificate. Linda, just a moment ago when you were talking about all of those trouble spots throughout the world, all those places of conflict, it sounded just like our former Holy Father, where at his audience he'd constantly go through a litany almost of places that needed our prayers, where we needed peace. And the Cardinals conclude their appeal: we invite all the faithful to intensify their supplication to the Lord for a just and lasting peace. Linda, I know you follow closely the Pope's appeals for peace over the years, not just Pope Francis, but also before that.
Yes, as you were speaking, my mind immediately went to an interview that our colleague in the Africa English section did immediately after the death of Pope Francis. He interviewed the Bishop of Juba in South Sudan, who said, "We have lost the only advocate we have on this world scenario. We have lost the only voice who brings our suffering to the international community whenever he can." You know, it's a huge, huge void. Who is going to speak for us?
One of the historical titles is Pontifex Maximus, right? The Pope is meant to be the chief bridge builder, and the papacy has a unique spot on the world stage to be able to do that with its diplomatic corps, with its experience in this area. And I think back, Francis stands in a long line of popes who have been dedicated single-mindedly to peace. I think Benedict, one of the reasons Benedict chose that the name was Benedict XV, the great Pope of Peace in World War I. And I think of all of the appeals that Pius XII made during the devastation of World War II. And so the papacy is a beacon and needs to continue to be a beacon for these peacemaking movements in the world.
Coming back to South Sudan again, yes, popes have traditionally been peacemakers, people appealing for peace, but I think one of Francis's great strengths, of course, was his gestures, his ability to speak through gestures. And thinking of South Sudan, Another thing that really comes to mind was the time that he met with the South Sudanese leaders, the president and the vice president, who were at loggerheads with each other. The conflict had been dragging on. He invited them to the Vatican for that session with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moderator of the Church of Scotland. And I'm sure you've all seen the pictures where he gets down on his knees with great difficulty, and he gets down on his knees to kiss the shoes of these leaders in an extraordinary symbolic gesture of humility, to say to these leaders, these military leaders, stop the fighting. You've been elected to serve your people. And these are the gestures that I think sadly hasn't seemed to have been able to put an end to the war in that country, but very, very poignant and powerful gestures which will remain with us.
And let's remember all the times the popes have gone to the United Nations. We'll never forget Jamais plus la guerre, Pope Paul VI, and then Pope John Paul II, and Pope Francis. They have all been to that incredible forum of nations, that family of nations, to say, stop fighting, listen to the voice of the people. And as Pope Francis very famously wrote in his encyclical Laudato Si, heed the cry of the earth, heed the cry of the poor. It's an incredibly important role.
And I think you mentioned Pope Paul's very heartfelt. You could see it on his face when he cried out, "Never again war, never again war." And I think every subsequent pope that's visited the United Nations has quoted him there. I'm not absolutely certain of that, but Dawn, you mentioned the unique place of the Catholic Church. The Church is present in just about every country in the world, so they have a stake in a lot of these conflicts. Some places the Church is very small. Mongolia has a community of a few thousand people.
1,500
Catholics.
With the Cardinal, though. Right?
With the Cardinal, who we saw today. Cardinal Marengo.
throughout the world. It does have the diplomatic corps, and I know you've done some studies to the diplomatic corps. It's not just the Pope's gestures, which are very, very important. You mentioned the beautiful gesture of the Pope kneeling at the feet of the leaders, but there's also so much work that goes on in the background, which is animated and inspired by the Pope. That's where the Secretary of State, the nuncios, are really trying to carry out the background work of trying to make the Pope's appeals a concrete reality.
One of the surprising things, people come to Rome, they find out it's a city with two sets of embassies, that there's embassies to the Republic of Italy and there's embassies to the Holy See. And the Holy See has diplomatic relations with an immense number of countries, including countries that are at utter loggerheads with one another. And so that in situations of war, in situations of conflict, nations can come to the Vatican and use the diplomatic service in order to exchange messages of peace, in order to exchange messages offering ceasefire. And so it's very important to remember the work of nuncios, of the special envoys. When the Pope sent Cardinal Zuppi to Ukraine as a special envoy for peace, that this is something the Catholic Church is very good at and can be a force for helping to establish lasting peace in these troubled areas.
And as you said, Don, that's something that the Church can do, where you can speak with both parties as, if not exactly a neutral party, but at least something that's a little taking a step back, where you can't talk to one another, but you can talk to someone else. We saw that with the Second World War and some of the tremendous work of the Department of State. We also have seen with the Secretary of State, one of the big issues is the plight of displaced persons, and that was a big work of Vatican Radio in its early history. Linda Philippa, maybe you could speak about that role of the Holy See in the humanitarian work of the role of Vatican Radio in the humanitarian work of the Holy See.
Well, I think you're probably referring to the Second World War,
especially,
right?
Yes.
When the radio started a service announcing the names of prisoners of war in order that people could tune in and hear whether their husbands, their fathers, their brothers were in these prisoner of war camps following the Second World War. And that was, as I say, way back after the Second World War. But of course, if you're talking about the plight of displaced people, then much more recently during this past decade, of course, we think of how significant an issue, I would say a top priority, this was for Pope Francis. Hard to forget that the first place he chose to visit after his election was the tiny island of Lampedusa down to the south of Italy here. Why? Because he wanted to remember all the people, all the many people who have lost their lives trying to flee their countries, trying to get to safety and security for their families, and losing their lives in the Mediterranean in these terrible flimsy boats that just capsize. And so these kind of, again, the image of him throwing that those flowers into the wreaths of flowers into the sea from the boat to remember the people who'd lost their lives there, and then speaking with other migrants who had successfully arrived in Lampedusa on that first visit. It was a theme that he started out that way, and he continued to do that all the way through his pontificate, to remember migrants and refugees and people seeking peace, seeking safety, seeking decent standards of living. It really was a top priority for him, I think.
And he did that in the company of the ecumenical patriarch, if I'm not mistaken. I think Bartholomew was on that boat with him.
Bartholomew went to the refugee camp in Lesbos.
Right.
I think you're thinking of the time he visited there when he went on a trip to Greece, and he travelled there with, yes, Patriarch Bartholomew, for whom also this is a priority. And it was, again, a moving occasion to talk to many of these men, women and children who had risked everything to cross the sea to try and get to safety. And meeting with refugees in the camp there was another very significant moment. But also here in the Vatican, you remember, he invited families, he had families come over here with the help of the St. Egidio community.
The humanitarian
corridors program. There was an awful lot of work went on together with the dicastery for integral human development and the refugee department there, and all the work that's been done, particularly during this past decade, I would say, is extremely significant.
Meanwhile, I'm seeing here on the chat that's adjourning us is that the people in the square are clapping their hands in an attempt to get the cardinals to hurry up with the voting process.
We're going to have an Urban VI situation.
Oh.
They've been in there for a couple of hours now, haven't they?
They have been, yeah, they've been waiting out there.
Maybe we can take a short musical break.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, we welcome you to Vatican Radio's live coverage of the Conclave to elect the 266th successor of St. Peter. 267th Pope, 266th successor, I think is last count. But that's actually an interesting point, because the official list of popes has changed numerous times over the years, and in fact there was a change in the 20th century with different popes who had traditionally been counted as popes suddenly struck from the list, and perhaps some other clarifications from historical scholars.
Well, so you have things like Benedict IX, who was pope 3 different times, and then John the 20th that didn't quite make the list eventually, and so they had to skip one. And so the list of popes does, when historians look at these things and they get more details and they get more ideas, the church will decide whether or not that this person was a legitimate Roman pontiff or not. Because this is an important question. This is a Catholic fact. We have to know who is the pope. We have to know because Christ promised this to his church, and so it's critical that we know who and what are. But so sometimes in the dim recesses of history where we have too few records, it's difficult to say for sure.
I'm not a historian myself, but of course the medallions in the great Basilica of St. Mary Major that contain the images.
Now that's St. Paul's Basilica outside the walls.
St. Paul's outside the walls, yes, you're right.
Yeah.
But presumably the number up on the wall there is what we consider to be the official tally, is that right?
Not quite, in fact, because at least a few anti-popes are up on medallions, including my personal favorite, at one time considered a pope, now considered an anti-pope, Pope Christopher, the one and only. He's one of them that they struck from the list due to the rather odd circumstances,
untoward circumstances regarding an election
of his accession. Meanwhile, if you are just joining us, we are entering the third hour of our coverage of the conclave. We are anxiously awaiting smoke to appear from the chimney in above the Sistine Chapel. That's still not happening. As we heard just a little while ago, the crowds that have now gathered in St. Peter's Square are getting a little enthusiastic in their expectation of the Pope. As we do enter our third hour, I would like once again to thank our television and radio partners, including EWTN TV, Catholic Faith Network in America, Shalom World Television Network USA, At Madarshan TV, Catholic TV, Mada TV India, and Uganda Catholic Television, UCTV, as well as radio partners Luminous Radio and Radio Katipunan in the Philippines. I'm here with Linda Bordoni, our very learned guests, Philippa Hitchin and Don Prudlow. And perhaps we could talk a little bit about what we can expect. Some of us have been listening to our broadcast now for a couple of hours and maybe wondering what's happening and what's going on right at the moment.
Well, I think they're getting ready to burn the ballots. Meantime, another thing we've all been chatting about in the run-up is what name will the new pontiff choose? Because it's a long-standing tradition that the baptismal name is changed, but it hasn't always been so, if I'm not mistaken. But we do know that the first act of the new pope, immediately after accepting his canonical election as the supreme pontiff and before fulfilling other obligations, is the choice of his name. And this name is announced famously on the loggia by the Cardinal Protodeacon after the famous formula Habemus Papam, followed by the Pope's baptismal name in Latin. So Francis was the first Francis. I remember we were going, we're going to call him Francis the First, and we were told, no, it's just Francis, he is the first. But it's an old custom that apparently emerged as early as the first millennium of Christianity, and I'm reading here, Professor, because
it's 1,500 years old, so it is a pretty well-established custom.
And can you tell us anything about the popularity of certain names, why they became so much more popular than others, why Francis perhaps was never chosen until this last pontificate?
Well, there have been a series of quite traditional names. I mean, there's a good list with 266 popes to choose from. There's good, and it ties people back into continuity with the past. Benedict, naming himself after Saint Benedict, and after Pope Benedict XV, the Pope of Peace. I tend to think Pope Benedict XIV, the great scholar pope as well, that he tied himself to. But and then you had the innovation of John Paul, right, having the two papal names. And he will be, if there ever is another Francis, he will have to be Francis I. I mean, he doesn't have any choice.
He will be Francis I.
He will have to be Francis. If there's a Francis II, there's going to have to be. Yeah, he'd have to be retroactively promoted to Francis I. But this is a great moment, because it's the first time that we can get an insight into the mind of the new pope when they have this name. So, for instance, if, as a lot of people think, the new pope may choose the name Leo, we know that that's probably in line with Leo's great work with social justice, with Catholic social teaching, but also, hopefully, Leo's great work with Catholic academics as well.
But how many Leos have there been?
Well, he would be Leo the 14th. So there would be Leo the 14th, but the John, you'd have John would be a popular one, Paul would be a popular one, or John Paul III even. But all those will have nuances, right? They'll all have meanings that the Pope will be able to tell us, and we won't be able to exhaust them. I mean, they're suggestive, right? We'll see. Well, that's an interesting name that.
And the commentators will be out in force to explain exactly why the Pope chose that particular name. We've seen that there's certainly a tradition of choosing names from immediate or close predecessors.
There has been, and Benedict sort of broke that, and that was interesting. And I think that's because we had John Paul and then John Paul. I think that was good to break off from that a little bit. But you're right, they go up and down in popularity. I doubt that we'll get a Sixtus VI. I think that we may have ended that line. That probably won't make it.
We haven't had many Pauls.
We haven't had many Pauls, right? There's been a lot more Johns than Pauls. But that's definitely a possibility. That's not. But then you have these strange names from early in papal history, right? Like Conon or Lando, and those are likely going to continue to stay in abeyance. But a name like Innocent or Clement, right? These were immensely popular in the 17th and 18th century. And they tied them back to those great histories with those names too. I mean, John's was kind of a surprise, because there had not been very many creditable Johns in papal history, and so it was kind of a surprise, particularly. And there was controversy even about his numbering, because one of the anti-popes of Avignon was John the 23rd. There's actually an anti-pope, John the 23rd, buried in Florence, so that was confusing as well. But he wanted to make his personal statement with that.
And as you say, some names gain popularity because of wildly popular popes, but some names fall off when you've had a pope who really did have, as you said, a discreditable reputation, and suddenly we see a lot fewer. One of perhaps the most famous bad popes, Alexander VI, and we did have a successor, but afterwards the name just kind of fell into disuse for now since several hundred years.
Right, that's right. But this, I mean, there was very good Alexanders in history as well some not so good Alexanders. But and popes don't always choose a name based on Christian principles. So Pius II, he was Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, and he was so enamored of the Aeneid that he wanted to be Pius Aeneas. So he was Pius II, not because of any devotion to St. Pius. Julius
because of the devotion to Virgil.
To Virgil. Well, it's much like Dante, right? Our beloved Dante. And Julius II wanted to be named after Julius Caesar. I think so. That worked. But there were both Piuses after Pius II and Juliuses after Julius II. So
having had so many Italian popes, of course, throughout history, all selecting from perhaps what you're talking about, some of the traditional names, I'm wondering what a difference it might make having cardinals from these 70 different countries, and if perhaps we should have a pope from Africa or Asia or again Latin America, wondering what difference that might make in the selection of a name.
That would be interesting, because we have had Greek popes and Syriac popes and African popes. The great Pope Gelasius was North African. and Pope Zephyrinus was Syrian. There was a period in the 8th century where we had almost all Greek and Syrian popes. And so looking back to that history would be instructive as well. I mean, to the persecuted Christians of the Middle East or of North Africa, it could point to that and still be rooted in the Church's history as well.
You certainly need a historian on hand, don't you, to help you make this selection. I can see that you're never going to be out of a job.
They've never let historians into the conclave, though. There's no on-call historian, so maybe.
And how important is it that a pope be proficient in Latin?
Well, I think it's critical as the patriarch of the West and as the head of the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church. I mean, it's pretty critical. And you saw, I mean, the when you have these big international events, you notice that the entire thing was conducted in Latin for these cardinals, and it helps in a certain sense to decenter any particular ethnicity or linguistic group that provides something of that common unity that when the liturgy used to be in one language, that did provide that commonality throughout the world, but still today provides it at these really critical moments, so that when all Christians come together in Rome to celebrate Mass with the Pope, that they can sing the Pater Noster as one in one language, and so I think that's a wonderful thing. So it's pretty critical that he knows. The new Pope will have to know Italian too, since Italian has become the lingua franca of the Holy See.
It was very interesting during the broadcast prior to this one when we watched the cardinals going into conclave, and there was a long moment where each of the cardinals swore to uphold the oath. The full oath was read by Cardinal Parolin, and then each successive cardinal said, "I personally swear to abide by this with my hands on the Gospels." But all of them made that oath in Latin. And if you were watching on the video, you saw they had a cheat sheet in front of them with the precise phrase. What was really fascinating, you saw Latin cardinals, but you also saw cardinals from Eastern churches from all over the world, and each of them was pronouncing the exact same words in Latin in their own language. And I thought that was one of the most moving parts of the ceremony, where you'd hear an American perhaps with a bit of an Irish accent, and you'd hear a Japanese cardinal or an African cardinal, or cardinals from all over the world.
I heard Stephen Brislin
with
his South African
out.
accent.
For those of you, I mean, we all remember Pope Benedict pronouncing his Latin with a very strong German accent, which I found very endearing. So it really does offer a kind of point of unity, where it's not a living language that's going to be privileged, but it's a language that everybody can kind of have a share in.
And yet the language question, of course, is quite an issue for cardinals coming from so many different countries, perhaps in places where they haven't had an education in Latin to the same degree as would happen here, for example, in the universities, the pontifical universities in Rome. Even in the general congregations and so on and so forth, what is the general rule for the language that is spoken? You mentioned the need to speak Italian, of course, if you are elected Pope, because that is the language. As the Bishop of Rome, you're expected to have a good command of Italian, but that isn't necessarily the case for a lot of these men, is it?
Several popes have reiterated the importance of learning Latin, and so, because I mean that's the language of canon law and of all official documents in the Catholic Church. It's really critical that we help to form young priests, especially in emerging countries. But then we also expect them, like you said, we expect them to learn Italian too, and so this is also extremely difficult for particularly non-Mediterranean, non-Western people, and so a privileging of Latin would sort of decenter Italian in that way a little bit. You would still have to learn Italian, but you'd have this more focused on that universal language.
And that's been an interesting question. Up until not very long ago, most of the cardinals would have had some common language, maybe not knowing Latin very well, but having a little bit so that they could at least talk to one another. And we already saw in the general congregations before that, in the various synods, the synods of synodality, where you have to come up with a language that people can understand, or make sure that different addresses, documents are translated into various languages. For a long time, the cardinals would have been largely well educated, and or when I say well, not good, but in the sense of had a lot of education and maybe could talk to one another. One of the things they've talked about with this conclave, with 133 different cardinals, not all of them speak Italian, not all of them speak English or Spanish, which are somewhat common languages, but they're in a room where if they want to talk to one another, there are some limitations as to their ability to communicate. And that
and we see it with synodality too, right? We often get shunted off into language groups, right? Which is sort of defeating the purpose of the whole idea. I mean, just it's difficult for us to conceive of, say, but Vatican II, to think back to Vatican II, and that the entire thing for 4 years was conducted in Latin, with everyone having an equal voice and able to discuss with one another in that. Now, it's possible that new translation software and things can come and make a difference like this, but having that common tongue has been something that's been very important to the Western world.
That would be an interesting technological change if in some future conclave they're all issued a universal communicator
translator,
to translate on the spot, and then you don't have to worry about translators coming in and violating.
And I think about that ecumenically too, because I mean the use of Latin transcended the boundaries of the Catholic Church for so many centuries. In Europe, it was the common diplomatic language. It was the language. There's a famous exchange between C.S. Lewis and an Italian priest. Neither of them spoke the other's language, so they wrote each other letters in Latin. And so that is one of those commonalities too that we all share.
Yeah. And we're still waiting for the
even the seagulls. Even the seagulls
Even the seagull has given up.
Yeah.
I'm hearing it's getting chilly out there as well.
And one of the things that we can expect is that at least some of the cardinals probably have in mind what effect this is having on people outside.
I would think, yes.
Could be a good sign because, or it could be just that they're waiting to burn the ballots. Who knows?
But they should, because it's just one ballot, that they wouldn't have to wait after the scrutiny is done.
But as you were saying earlier, I think, Chris, this is going to affect timings, isn't it? I'm imagining not just today, but we start again tomorrow morning. Just give us a recap of the times that are expected. The cardinals gather again at 9 o'clock in the morning, is that right? Inside the Sistine Chapel?
They begin with Mass and prayer. The actual voting is largely, as we've said, it's not a point. The conclave is not a place where people are going to get up and give campaign speeches or much speeches at all. I've heard many cardinals talk about conclaves as more like a retreat than anything else. And when they come into the Sistine Chapel and do the vote, that's all they do. So what we've been kind of expecting, it's very imprecise, as we're seeing even as we speak. We're kind of expecting the first votes to take place and maybe be finished up by 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the morning. If there's a positive outcome, we would see the white smoke then. If not, they'll proceed immediately to a second vote, which is then going to take another hour, an hour and a half. And at the conclusion of that vote, they will burn ballots from both of the previous scrutinies. So then we could see either black or white smoke. The kind of general feeling and general ideas that might happen around 1 o'clock each day.
Yeah, and let's remember that this service that we are providing is not just in English, of course. Being Vatican Radio, it's in 7 languages, the live service that we are doing now, but the other languages will also be broadcasting, so it's going out in a lot of languages as we speak. And of course, everything is on our website, on our social media, on Twitter,
and not just spoken languages.
And not just spoken languages, the sign languages, in various sign languages. There's the Italian sign language, the American sign language. And I'm hearing here that we have Devon on the line. He's still in the square. Devon. Hello. Hi. Good. Is it getting dark? We're all wondering what's going to happen. We've entered the 2.5 hours since the beginning of this commentary, and so yes, the seagull appears to have also left its position next to the chimney.
Perhaps also growing impatient.
Have you spoken to any other pilgrims or Romans in the square who have specially come for the occasion? Absolutely. We will. Thank you very much, Devon.
And what's very interesting is that if they have chosen not to do a vote this evening, or if there's a problem, that's probably not the level of intervention that will cause them to break the conclave. So there's no real means for them to let us know what's happening inside. So we're gonna keep guessing and keep waiting and praying. For those of you who are listening in, we can tell you a little bit about how you can listen in to and follow the papal election on Vatican Media. As we mentioned, we followed the Mass for the election of the Roman Pontiff earlier this morning. You can learn some more about that on our website. If you're watching on TV, you see our famous seagull has returned, at least one of them. There are various languages that you can follow the events in, including sign languages, American Sign Language, and some of the Spanish and Italian versions. Vatican Media is also providing video and photo coverage of the various events that took place today, the Mass and the entry into the Conclave. And we will be opening up a live broadcast for each of the periods when we do expect a papal vote continuing tomorrow morning, beginning at, I believe, 10 a.m.
I think the broadcast goes live at 10:30 a.m.
10:30 a.m.
That's right.
And you can go to our Vatican website to find all of the broadcast times, and we do really hope you will join us. We do invite you as well to visit our social media pages, including Facebook, X, Instagram, and YouTube, where you can follow along and see everything that's happening, or in this case not happening, this evening, as we wait for the sign that a scrutiny has taken place.
You're talking about social media, you're talking about the radio broadcasts. Of course, the Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper, is also waiting anxiously for the results of this papal election. If I remember rightly, they produce a special edition,
remember rightly.
Yes. And almost as soon as the announcement is made on the balcony, the presses start rolling, or at least the copy editors start putting out this edition so that it can be distributed free, I think, in St. Peter's Square to people as soon after the event.
As was the one that marked the passing of Pope Francis. Meanwhile, they tell me we have someone else in the square. It's Sister Nina Kravich. She works here at the Dicastery for Communications. She is a communications expert. Nina, hello. It's your first conclave, isn't it, Nina? You are an expert in communications, but not only in social media communications. How do you think Generation X, the millennials, are following this conclave? How do you think? I was speaking about social media, which is very much your field, and getting the message out to the younger generations. How are they following this conclave? What kind of interest have you been perceiving from them? You are very young yourself, Nina. Well, you know how we knew that you were there, Nina? Leo, my son Leo, saw you on Instagram in the square. Right. A chimney and a seagull, yes. Thank you, Nina. Yes. We'll be speaking to you again. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. So that was Nina Krapic. She knows all about influencers and the dicastery that has understood very profoundly that it has to move with the times if it wants to keep up with the world, and has brought her in to study the role of influencers in communication and to talk to gatherings. She goes to speak at conferences about the church and communications with a very new voice.
You need a dicastery of influencing.
Interesting, though, that what we think of as the generation that likes everything instantly, that people should be standing there for an hour and a half, 2.5 hours now, watching a chimney without anything happening at all. So quite a turnout for the books, and interesting to see the reaction. Will people not be so interested over the coming days, or will that simply increase the tension and increase the interest? We'll have to see tomorrow what happens.
Francesca's telling me the numbers have gone up. There are 45,000 people in the square at 20:35. That's 25 to 9 local time here in Rome.
Well, it's still mercifully before Italian dinner time, but it's well past American dinner time.
You were giving us the timeline, Chris, earlier on. Tomorrow in the morning, as you say, the cardinals go in. They have 2 votes in the morning. Then they break for lunch, don't they?
They do have a break in the afternoon. They will, after the second vote, if the first vote is not conclusive, they'll go immediately to the second vote. Then they do have some time. They'll have their lunch. There'll be more prayers. Of course, each session of the voting in the Sistine Chapel is marked by prayer, especially to the Holy Spirit. We can take a look at some of the prayers that we saw today for the opening of the conclave. And then the expectation is, Don was just talking about Roman meal times, but time for a long lunch or a nap, and then they'll be back in the Sistine Chapel.
Always in the seclusion of Santa Marta.
Always in the seclusion of Santa Marta. I was struck, we've mentioned a couple of times, the movie The Conclave, and we've all seen various parts of the Conclave, and I noticed a lot of the sets bear zero resemblance whatsoever to the places they're purporting to be. But going back to the schedule, we will have, or expect to have, a vote in the afternoon. That's what's provided for in Universi Dominici Gregis. We'll begin coverage around 4 in the afternoon Rome time. And if there is a successful vote, we'll see the white smoke. Otherwise, we'll have to wait for a few more hours, and possibly the first smoke we might see in the afternoon in coming days might be around 5:30 or 6. Later, if it does go to a second ballot, we will see smoke of some sort, hopefully, around 7 or 7:30 is the expectation. But as we talked about, there was
I'm getting news about that. Apparently the last time there was not a vote, so there was no smoke during the session, was in 1941. But they're also pointing
there wouldn't
out...
have been, right? Because there wasn't a conclave that year.
Ooh, wow.
So that was to be expected.
So that was not a good information I get here. Because they also point out there were far fewer cardinals in that conclave, but as you say, no conclave in 1941.
Maybe they meant 1939.
We'll have to check that. Check on that again.
And still nothing. It still looks quite light out there.
And of course, the cameras are pointing out towards the west, so the last shreds of daylight will be seen from the perspective that we're looking at the chimney. Whereas if you, for those in the square, if they turn around and look out to the east, they'll see that the light is dying out. We can see out the window here, sky's growing pretty dark in the other direction, and we might have a situation where it does become difficult to see the smoke or tell what color it is.
In which case we would be waiting for the bells again, as we were mentioning earlier, if it's a successful vote. Otherwise people will be craning their necks to see what they can see from the square. But
meanwhile, it might be a good opportunity to talk about one of the unique features of this conclave. For, as we've mentioned earlier, there are 133 cardinals who entered into the conclave. That's the largest number of cardinals ever. And there was actually a little bit of a discrepancy in the law and the procedures governing the conclave, because Paul VI in 1975 had introduced a rule that the maximum number of cardinal electors would not be more than 120. Don, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the history of the numbers of electors. Maybe even going back a little further, the question of who would be made an elector was a very contentious issue, and when popes would make new cardinals to influence perhaps the conclaves, this was a big point of contention with the college at times.
Yes, absolutely. So the origins of as you know, there are 3 levels of cardinals. There's cardinal bishops, there's cardinal priests, and cardinal deacons. And originally, there are 6 cardinal bishops of the suburbicarian sees. He's like Frascati and Ostia. Ostia is the senior bishop on the see. There were 35 cardinal priests. Cardinal priests were drawn from the original tituli, the early parishes of the city of Rome. And so we can see before even the year 500 the lists of the original parishes, and they would be given the title to these parishes. And there were 14 cardinal deacons. The city was divided into 14 different districts based on the needs of the faithful. And so as time went on, this number was fixed at 70. But during the early modern period, the church had grown so much and worldwide that 70 wasn't enough to give a decent representation for the church anymore. And so during the after Vatican II, the number was increased to 120, and this allowed for a much wider representation of cardinals from throughout the world. And the discrepancy came because because popes wanted to make more appointments, because you have cardinals aging out all the time. There are always, every month or two you have another cardinal that doesn't get to vote anymore. And it's not just Francis that exceeded the number. Benedict and John Paul also exceeded the number. They just did not have a conclave during the period when the number was exceeded. And so clearly it's the manifest will of the supreme legislator, the three last popes, that if there were to be a conclave, it would be that all the eligible electors. So the cardinals a couple days ago made a decision saying that this was the manifest will of the elector. All cardinals under 80 who are in Rome and can participate can vote.
Joining us now in studio, we have Joseph Tulloch, our very own Joseph Tulloch from the English section. We were mentioning the Mass this morning. Joseph was actually one of the readers at that Mass, as he read the other day at after the funeral Mass in suffrage for Pope Francis. Joe, you were standing out there in that square filled with tens of thousands of people. First of all, would you like to tell us what that felt like and how you lived this experience?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, I'm Joe. I'm part of the English team here at Vatican News. And what Linda's talking about there is, so I was reading this morning, but before that I had the chance to read at the second, what they call Novem Diales Mass, so the second Mass basically in memory of Pope Francis. It was really nice. It was a really great opportunity to say goodbye to the Pope. That was right after the death, and we were still really missing him. So that was a really great opportunity. There's about 200,000 people showed up for that Mass. I think some of them had been planning to come. There was supposed to be the canonization of Carlo Acutis on that day, and so there was lots of young people who were already going to be in Rome. But what was nice was they were clearly happy to be there for the Mass that they had to go to instead, which was the second memorial Mass for the Pope. There's lots of cheering. They really, there was really. Sorry, I thought I saw a flash of smoke there, but it was just a seagull's wing, I think.
Right.
Very disappointing. Yeah, so that was a really great opportunity. And then this morning too, that was the Missa pro Eligendo, so the Mass for the election of the Pope, and it's basically this opportunity for the cardinals to come together, and together with the people of God, lots of ordinary Catholics and perhaps some non-Catholics gathered in the Basilica with them to pray and to invoke the Holy Spirit on this conclave process. So really nice. I did, to be honest, when I've been here now at Vatican News for about 2.5 years, and I always imagined that the conclave would be this period where I'd be doing so much journalism and going around and reporting on everything, and in the end I've just read a lot of Masses. But that's nice as well, and I've
You've been working hard as well, writing
that's true as well.
And what reading did you do this morning?
So it was a reading, putting me on the spot, it was from, I think, the prophet Isaiah, and really nice reading about, I think it's the one that has, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, He has appointed me to preach the good word to the poor, something like that. So the kind of a reading coming out of this prophetic tradition in the Old Testament, and of course the readings are picked, I assume, with kind of the idea of reminding the cardinals of what they're looking for in a pope. So somebody who will have the poor in mind. I think I'm getting the reading right. It's funny actually, when you're there reading, you're so focused on saying the words right that you're not even thinking about what it means. So I may have misremembered what the reading was.
No, I think you're remembering rightly.
Yeah.
That it was focused on the characteristics that a new pope should hopefully have. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Joe is going to be in studio with us again in these coming days as we await the smoke, unless at this point it could be white.
Who knows? Yeah, who knows?
Who knows?
So that's right. I'm going to be joining on Friday morning. If, of course, we could very well have a new pope by then, because by then there will have been there'll be 9 ballots between now and Friday morning. So there's 1 ballot this evening, and then there'll be 4 tomorrow. And so it's quite possible to have a new pope by Friday morning, but if not, you'll be able to listen to me and my wonderful colleague Francesca Merlo, who's producing today, but she'll be joining me in the studio on Friday morning. If we don't have a pope by then, who knows?
Yes, thank you here to Francesca Merlo and to Mario Scarton, who are both working on the other side of the window here in this Vatican Radio studio.
We've been talking a bit about all that's happened between the funeral and the general congregations leading up to this conclave. Perhaps we could just take a brief look at actually what happens. We've talked about the Pope coming out onto the balcony, the first acclamation by the people of Rome and so on, but then we have to look forward also to the installation, the inauguration of the new papal ministry. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about what happens then, remembering past occasions. It's usually about a week, isn't it, between the announcement, between the successful outcome of the conclave.
Well, first of all, all the delegations that are going to be here in Rome for that ceremony have to get here, so it can't be immediately afterwards. There are some technical times that have to be respected, so even should the Pope be elected on Friday, it couldn't be on Sunday. It would just be too early, although on Sunday he could probably do his first Angelus address.
Yes, absolutely. And we have to remember that if he's a bishop already, and all the cardinals in there, and most of the cardinals are bishops, that he becomes Pope the moment he accepts. When the cardinal asks him, do you accept the canonical election as Roman pontiff, and he says yes, he's the Pope. And so the installation mass is it's not a formality, it's a very important moment that he inaugurates his Petrine ministry. But he becomes Pope with full authority at that moment. And then the inauguration, I remember being at the inauguration in 2013 and being up on the colonnade. That was a great privilege. I love doing that. You see, because then you allow people just for the funeral too, like when they have the delay, you want the dignitaries to be able to come, and they will come. I mean, as we've seen it, I mean, the world pays attention to what happens in the city, and that's critical. But there's a whole set of ceremonies that go along with the new Pope, right? That culminate really after the installation mass with the actual possessio, the taking possession of his cathedral at St. John Lateran, which I was also present for when Pope Francis took charge of his cathedral. And so this is a wonderful series of events that makes fuller the meaning of what's happening in the Sistine Chapel right now.
Pope Francis particularly wanted his inauguration, if I remember correctly, to be on the feast day of St. Joseph, isn't that right? And that, of course, became, again, a bit of a theme during the pontificate. We learnt that he had the statue of the sleeping Joseph that he would keep on his bedside table there in Santa Marta. Had a particular significance for him, didn't it?
And he inserted the name of Joseph in every mass that was said throughout the world. So this a great devotion to St. Joseph, to St. Joseph in his feast days, as patron of the Universal Church, but also as a patron of workers and as a patron of Christian fathers. It was very important to him, for sure.
The thing I remember particularly about the installation of Francis, of course, was that it was only 3 days apart from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and because I was covering ecumenical affairs, I wanted to be in both places, and fortunately, because there was that little time gap, it could have been on the same day, but actually in the end I was able to be here in Rome for the papal inaugural mass, the papal installation, and then get to Canterbury as well for the Archbishop of Canterbury's taking the beginning of his ministry there in Canterbury Cathedral. And there was a nice when Francis died, there was a nice little tribute from Justin Welby, no longer of course the Archbishop of Canterbury, but there was a nice tribute in which he talks about his first meeting with Pope Francis, and he was ushered into these extraordinarily elaborate and baroque surroundings in the Apostolic Palace, and feeling a little bit intimidated anyway, and he sits down, and the Pope begins by saying, I'm senior to you, as you know, and of course his kind of heart sunk, and he thought, well, this kind of wasn't the tone I was expecting, and then the Pope looks up and jokes and goes, by 3 days only, and that was kind of the tone that the jokes continued, and it was the beginning of a very strong relationship in which they kind of lived out this ministry of walking and working together, which became the leitmotif of the sort of Anglican-Catholic dialogue through this past 12 years.
Well, in a much more modest register, we also learnt to know him and to walk with him after that 13th of March, which we don't forget because we were here. We didn't know who Bergoglio was, and very slowly we began to understand him, he went to Lampedusa, as you mentioned, his very first journey abroad, after having said that he didn't really want to travel. It wasn't his thing, but he went to Lampedusa because that issue was so important for him. And being there, he realized, he told us afterwards, he realized how important it was for the people to feel his closeness and to feel he was going to them. And he ended up undertaking 48 apostolic journeys abroad, as well as many others within Italy. Joe was on his last apostolic journey abroad to Belgium.
Yeah,
penultimate, because the last one was to Corsica.
Exactly.
But you went to Belgium.
That's right. Yeah. So there was a very quick one to Corsica where he came back, and I think within the day, exactly. But before that, the longest kind of traditional papal journey, the last traditional papal journey was the one he did to Luxembourg and Belgium. I was with the Pope for the stop he did in Belgium, and it was an interesting papal journey because it came right after this huge one that lasted several weeks across a couple of countries in Asia. So
4 countries.
4 countries in Asia.
Asia and Oceania.
Yeah, and there'd been some. So, for instance, he'd been in East Timor, where something crazy like 70% or 60% of the population turned up for a mass he celebrated, and these incredible scenes. And I think it's the most Catholic country in the world, with the possible exception of Vatican City.
No, I think it's more Catholic than
the
Vatican City.
Okay.
That's what the Vatican officials quit. But
okay, right. And so he'd just come back from that, and then he came to Belgium, which is obviously a fairly secular country. It's a country that's been really marked by the sexual abuse crisis, which is something that's happened in the church all over the world, but it was particularly bad in Belgium. And so it's a country where there's also, on a level, there's some also distrust, I think you can say, towards the church. And so it was a very interesting papal journey for that reason. The Pope did a couple of things. So he met with survivors of sexual abuse, and that was a closed-door meeting, so there were no journalists there. We don't know exactly what was said, but there were some interviews afterwards with some of the survivors who said that he really listened to them and they felt moved by that. And he also visited some universities. So Belgium is home to 2 famous Catholic universities. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. One is, I think, Leuven, and one is Louvain, and one is Dutch-speaking or Flemish-speaking, the other one is French-speaking, and they're 2 very historic, very prestigious Catholic universities, and the Pope visited both of them. There was, if I remember rightly, there was at Leuven, the Flemish Dutch-speaking one. He kind of had an exchange with the professors, and then what was interesting was afterwards when he came to Louvain, it was more a dialogue with the students. But on both kind of occasions, he was doing what we really came to expect from Pope Francis, which was this dialogue, kind of talking to people, even people who disagreed with him. I remember there was some when the students were talking to him, as well as they agreed with a lot of what he said, and then they were pointing out some points where they disagreed, and that was really typical of Pope Francis as well, this desire to talk to people, even people that didn't agree with him.
Absolutely.
And so it was kind of it was a classic Francis trip in that way.
I was speaking to the international director of the Jesuit Refugee Service just slightly after his death, and he said very much what you have been saying. He would sit down and enter into dialogue with the person he had before him, and it was never a problem to disagree or to listen to a differing perspective. In fact, he was interested in doing exactly that.
Yeah. Certainly the fact of his meeting with Jesuits wherever he travelled in any of the journeys around the world became a particular hallmark, didn't it, of these trips, and I think a particularly important moment for the Jesuit community throughout the world. I'm wondering, Don, if you can tell us anything about the frequencies of popes belonging to particular orders as opposed to those who don't. I mean
it's not terribly common. We remember it was almost a shock when Jorge Bergoglio was a Jesuit, right? It was kind of popularly thought that a Jesuit would never become pope, so that was very shocking. There have been several popes from religious orders. From the Franciscans and Dominicans, each have a handful of popes. None since the 18th century, late 18th century. There have been some monk popes, particularly during the period of the monastic revival in the 11th century. But by and large, they have been taken, a lot of them, from the secular clergy. That's been mainly, and they've kind of gone back and forth between the diplomatic corps and between canon lawyers and theologians, and that's been pretty much the case. There hasn't been too much of a... While there is always, I would say, about 50% of representation in the College of Cardinals come from religious orders. They do not often get elected to the papacy. And I don't think it's any particular animus against... It maybe historically have been against Jesuits, but that's not... But and I'm talking back from the very foundation of the order. But it's really something that the person has to fit the job too. And very often religious orders are focused on a ministry. They're focused on a particular specialty. And the pastor, the secular priest, the bishop has got to be all things to all people. And that often is better training for the kind of things you'll encounter in the papacy than other forms of religious living.
And I wonder, is that 15% roughly the same today with the cardinals who are gathered behind the walls of the
I'd
Sistine
have to
Chapel
look.
there?
I could make a count, but I would suggest it's roughly 15 to 20%.
And so after the Pope died, I saw a couple of headlines saying something along the lines of Pope Francis never stopped being a Jesuit. And this idea that as you were saying there, that each of these orders has their own charism and they really mark the members of those orders. I don't know if you have any thoughts about the ways in which Pope Francis never stopped being a Jesuit, the ways in which his Jesuit formation really shaped him and became the Pope that we all knew.
I think the Jesuit formation creates such strong individuals. They are able to... I mean, think of the great Jesuit missionaries that are able to operate. They're meant from the very foundation not to live in religious community, right? I mean, they're meant to be able to be sort of sole proprietors sometimes when they need to be. And so go off like Francis Xavier around the world by themselves, never see another Jesuit for years and years and years. And I think that kind of style, that kind of particularly the Jesuit emphasis on obedience and on sort of the voluntas of the superior was very much in evidence in ways that you might not see from a Dominican perspective as well. So I think that strongly individualistic way of doing things, I don't mean individualism in a bad sense, I mean a strong, well-formed person that is able to act and knows their mind and acts in that way. And Jesuit formation is really effective at creating that. And so I think we saw some of those aspects coming out in his papacy for sure.
Would you say also the question of discernment, which is a particular feature of the spiritual exercises of the Jesuit mindset in some ways, and of course the discernment process is perhaps at the basis of this synodality, the synods on synodality and so on that Pope Francis has begun and as we know has set in motion through to another synod in 2028. I think that would perhaps also be another feature of
I think
of
so.
the
That's
Jesuits.
exactly right.
Yeah.
I'd like to remember Pope Francis's last gift, which was a Pope Mobile that has been readapted, thank you, Philippa, into a health clinic for the people of Gaza. I think that is such a significant and powerful gesture, reminding the world of those most in need.
And it came of course following the phone calls that he traditionally made so regularly to the parish, the Holy Family Parish in Gaza, which I think you visited. I was able to do so when I went there
When you went.
To the Holy Land some years ago, and was able to go to Gaza with the previous parish priest, and you know how significant it is, how important it is in any situation of conflict like that to know that the world has not forgotten you, to know that people are praying for you, that people are praying for peace. And clearly those phone calls that Pope Francis insisted on making right up until
even
the previous weekend.
From the hospital, when he was in the hospital, when he could, he would call Padre Romanelli and just ask them what they'd had for dinner.
Smoke.
We do have smoke
have
coming out of
smoke.
that chimney, but it's
And it is
definitely
black
black.
Definitely black smoke. It's 21 hours. It's 9 o'clock in the evening here in Rome. And that is,
They took their time with
They
it.
took their time, they had a good think. They listened to a meditation by the papal preacher, which probably took time as well. Definitely black smoke there, I would say.
And I wonder what the reaction is in the square below, to the crowds who are seeing that, and knowing that there has been no decision, no successful outcome on this occasion. And now we have a shot of the square. I can see some cell phones flashing away there. Whether they'll be able to capture that black smoke billowing in the wind there out of the chimney and away across the rooftop of the Sistine Chapel and the rest of the Vatican museums, I'm not sure, but that's certainly black smoke.
I wonder if we have some sound from the square there. Do we have squares? No, we don't. They tell us we don't. But we can see. Here we are.
Well,
The noise
they've
of
made
the
sure
crowd.
of it at least. That's good. They've
Oh,
got
wow.
a good bit of it. Yes, a good crowd in the square.
And you can see, of course, those giant screens set up so
Right.
that even if you can't actually see from where you're standing,
Which it looks
Yeah.
difficult to
Which
see from
it
that
does.
it does,
It
doesn't
does.
it? Yeah. And in fact, I remember that from past
And as you were
years.
saying, it's
At
dark.
nighttime, yes,
Mhm.
Yes.
it becomes difficult.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, that is again. I never fail to be moved by the sight of our most beautiful city, the Bernini colonnade, St. Peter's illuminated, that night sky. It could have rained today, but it didn't, which was also
It
a
looks
blessing
like we
for
may
many.
have good weather for the rest of the week. So
There you are.
And you can see if you're watching on the television screen, it is now completely dark in Rome. The lights are on, the new illumination of the dome of St. Peter's. And the crowd, I think, is very relieved to see smoke, and very definite black smoke. I think
Definite
there's
black
no
smoke.
question from the very beginning.
I want to say thanks to Joseph Tulloch for joining us there. He disappeared out of the
Yes, and
studio.